I arrived at my father's funeral to find the will had already been read. Without me. My sister-in-law had scheduled it 3 days early, told everyone I had declined to attend, and walked away with the house I grew up in. $200,000 in assets, transferred while I was on a plane. What I did in the next 48 hours got me on the front page of the local paper. My name is Nora, and I was 31 years old when I learned that grief and greed move on the exact same timeline. Before I keep going, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had someone use your pain against you while you weren't looking, hit like and subscribe. You're going to want to stay for the end of this one. My father, a retired civil engineer from Raleigh, North Carolina, spent 40 years building a quiet, careful life. He was not a wealthy man by most definitions, but he owned his home outright, had a modest investment portfolio, and had set aside enough for both his children to have a real foundation when he was gone. He used to say the greatest thing a parent could do was leave their kids with fewer obstacles than they started with. He believed that down to his bones. He passed on a Tuesday morning in late February. I was in Chicago for a regional audit conference, the kind of work trip I had taken a dozen times without incident. My firm handles forensic accounting. I trace money for a living. I find what people hide. It is not glamorous work, but I am very, very good at it. I got the call from my brother at 7:14 in the morning. I remember the time because I had just ordered room service coffee and my hand was still on the phone when it rang. He told me Dad was gone, peaceful in his sleep, which was the only mercy in any of it. I told him I would get on the first flight I could find. He said, "Okay, take your time, we're all still in shock." What my brother did not tell me, what he could not have told me, because I would later find out he did not know either, was that his wife had already started making phone calls. My sister-in-law, who I will call by the role she played in this story rather than any name that might make her seem human, had been angling toward my father's estate for the better part of 3 years. She was meticulous about it in the way that only truly calculating people are, never obviously greedy, always just helpfully involved. She volunteered to drive him to doctor's appointments after his hip surgery. She organized his filing cabinet. She offered sweetly to be listed as an emergency contact when my brother was traveling for work. She made herself indispensable through small, patient gestures, and my father, who was lonely after my mother died and genuinely did not see cruelty in people he loved, let her in further than he should have. I flew home Wednesday morning. My flight landed at 11:42 a.m. I had texted my brother from the gate, letting him know I was close. He replied with a thumbs up, said the family had gathered at Dad's house and that he would see me soon. I took a rideshare straight from the airport. I remember walking up the front path, the one with the cracked flagstone Dad always meant to fix, carrying my carry-on over my shoulder in my work blazer because I hadn't had time to change. The front door was unlocked. I pushed it open and walked into a house full of relatives I hadn't seen in years, all holding paper plates with food someone had already organized and delivered. My brother was standing by the kitchen counter. When he saw me, something flickered across his face that I couldn't quite name in the moment. I thought it was grief. I understand now it was closer to relief. The specific relief of a person who knows something bad is about to happen and is glad they won't be the one to explain it. My sister-in-law came around the corner from the hallway. She was dressed in a black blazer, hair pulled back, expression calibrated to something between sorrow and efficiency. She looked like someone running a project. She hugged me, which I allowed, and then she said, her voice very gentle and very practiced, that she was so glad I had made it in time for the reception. I asked her what she meant by in time. She tilted her head. The reading, she said. We had to move it up. The estate attorney had a scheduling conflict and the family all agreed it was better to handle it while everyone was together. I stood very still. I said, "What reading?" She said, "The will." "We read the will yesterday afternoon, Nora. I sent you a message." She had not sent me a message. I had my phone open before she finished the sentence. There was nothing. No text, no email, no missed call from an unknown number, nothing. She had constructed a notification that existed only in the version of events she intended to narrate. I looked at my brother. He looked at the counter. That was the moment I understood exactly what was happening. Not the details yet, not the mechanism. But the shape of it, I recognized the shape immediately because I had seen it before in depositions and audit trails and the financial wreckage of people who trusted the wrong person at the wrong time. I set down my carry-on very carefully. I smoothed the front of my blazer. I did not cry and I did not raise my voice. I have never once solved a problem by crying or raising my voice in a professional context, and this had just become a professional context whether I wanted it to or not. I asked my sister-in-law to please tell me, quietly and clearly, what the whistle said. She told me. The house had been left to my brother. The investment accounts, approximately $200,000 across 3 brokerage accounts, had been split, 70% to my brother, 30% to me. There was also a provision leaving my father's truck and his woodworking tools to a neighbor he had been close with for 20 years, which sounded exactly like my father and which I had no objection to. What I objected to was that this was not the will my father had discussed with me 18 months ago, in the kitchen of that same house over coffee, when he told me he planned to split everything equally between his 2 children because he believed in fairness above all other things. I asked who the estate attorney was. My sister-in-law gave me a name I didn't recognize. She said he had been their family attorney for several years. Their family, not my father's family, hers. My brother finally looked up from the counter. He said, "Nora, it's what Dad wanted." I looked at my brother. My brother who I had called every Sunday for 15 years, who I had helped move 3 times, who I had lent money to twice without ever once asking for it back. And I asked him, very quietly, if he had been in the room when Dad signed this version of the will. He said no. My sister-in-law had handled the logistics. I picked up my carry-on. I told them I needed some air. I walked back out the front door, down the cracked flagstone path, and sat on the curb next to my rideshare driver's car because there was nowhere else to go. I called my own attorney, a woman I had worked with on 3 separate estate fraud cases, from the curb in front of my childhood home. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I knew so far. She told me not to sign anything, not to acknowledge the will verbally as legitimate, and to get her a copy of the document as fast as I could. Then she said something I already knew but needed to hear. "Nora, you trace money for a living, start tracing, 48 hours. That was what I gave myself. 2 days to find out exactly what had happened to my father's estate, and to make sure that whatever I found, it could not be buried again. I had one significant advantage that my sister-in-law had not accounted for. My father and I had spoken on the phone every Wednesday evening for the last 6 years. Every Wednesday, without fail, we talked about his garden, and my cases, and the news, and the neighborhood, and whatever book he was reading. In the last year of his life, he had started mentioning his estate planning more frequently, partly because his doctor had been frank with him about his heart, and partly because he was, at his core, a man who liked to have things in order. He had mentioned the attorney's name, his attorney, the one he'd used for 15 years, a man named Mr. Alderman out of the same office on Glenwood Avenue where he'd had his previous will drafted, not the name my sister-in-law had given me. I called Mr. Alderman's office from the parking lot of a coffee shop 2 miles from my father's house at 7 a.m. on Thursday morning. His assistant picked up. I told her who I was and who my father was. There was a pause on the line, and then she said very carefully that Mr. Alderman would want to speak with me directly, and could I come in that morning? I was in his office by 9. Mr. Alderman was a quiet, precise man in his late 60s, who kept files the way my father kept his woodworking workshop, everything in its exact place, nothing wasted. He told me that my father had visited his office in October, 8 months before he died, and had updated his will. He told me the updated will left the house and all financial assets split equally between his 2 children, with a small charitable gift to the local library where my mother had volunteered for 20 years. He told me that in January, someone had contacted his office claiming to be my father and requesting that all estate documents be forwarded to a new attorney for consolidation purposes. The request had come by email. His assistant had followed up by phone. The person who answered confirmed the request. It was not my father's voice. Mr. Alderman knew it, but they had not been able to reach my father directly to verify. He had been hospitalized briefly in January for a cardiac episode, and the calls had been routed through my brother's household. I sat very still in that leather chair and felt the entire architecture of what had been done snap into place around me. My sister-in-law had intercepted the correspondence. She had impersonated my father during a period when he was medically vulnerable and largely dependent on her for communication with the outside world. She had redirected his legal documentation to an attorney she controlled. She had then arranged for a new will to be executed, a will that shifted the asset distribution in her husband's favor, and had timed the reading for a window when she knew I would be out of state. She had done all of this carefully over months, with the patience of someone who was very confident she would not be caught. She did not know what I do for a living. I spent the next 36 hours doing what I have done professionally for 9 years. I pulled bank records. I cross-referenced email metadata. I contacted the State Bar Association to run the credentials of the attorney she had used and discovered he had 2 active disciplinary complaints and a history of involvement in estate disputes that had been settled quietly and expensively. I obtained a copy of the newly executed will through my attorney and flagged 14 irregularities in the document itself, including a notarization date that fell during a period when my father had been admitted to the hospital and physically could not have visited any law office. I also, on Thursday evening, called the FBI field office for financial crimes and spoke with an agent I had worked with on a wire fraud case the previous year. I did not ask for anything yet. I simply told her what I was finding and I asked her to be available on Friday morning. I did not tell my brother what I was doing. I did not tell my sister-in-law. I answered their texts with brief, neutral responses. I said I was managing my grief in my own way. I said I would be at the house Friday afternoon to collect some of my father's personal items. Friday afternoon, I arrived at the house. My sister-in-law was there. My brother was there. 2 of my aunts were there. A neighbor I had grown up next door to was there. My sister-in-law had, in the 3 days since my father's death, already moved several pieces of furniture to what she described as storage. She had donated 4 boxes of his books. She had placed a small label on the refrigerator that said, in her handwriting, "For the new kitchen remodel." She had been in the house for 3 days and she was already remodeling it. I set my bag down by the door. I greeted my aunts. I hugged the neighbor. I thanked the people who had brought food. And then I walked into the living room, where my sister-in-law was directing my brother to move a side table my father had built by hand from reclaimed oak, and I said, with complete calm, that I had something I'd like everyone to hear. My sister-in-law looked at me with the measured wariness of someone who is managing a situation. She thought I was about to grieve loudly. She thought I was emotionally overloaded and about to make a scene she would have to diplomatically contain. I could see her preparing the tone, the gentle redirection, the sympathetic head tilt. I pulled a folder from my bag. I said, 3 days ago, when I walked into this house and found out that a will reading had occurred without my knowledge, I made some calls. I would like to share what I found. My brother said, "Nora, this is not the time." I said, "It is exactly the time. Because if we wait past Monday, certain financial transfers will complete and certain records will become significantly harder to recover." The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone can feel that something real is happening. I turned to my sister-in-law and I walked her through it. Not emotionally, not with accusation in my voice. I laid it out the way I would lay it out in a deposition, chronologically, factually, with documentation. I showed the letter from Mr. Alderman confirming my father's legitimate final will and the date it was executed. I showed the email records indicating that someone had contacted his office in January requesting document redirection and that the email had originated from an IP address registered to my brother's household. I showed the discrepancies in the notarization. I showed the bar complaints against the attorney she had used. My aunts, who had known my father for his entire life, were very still. My brother had gone pale. My sister-in-law, to her credit, did not immediately break. She is not a person who breaks easily. She looked at the documents and then looked at me and said, in a steady voice, that I was making serious accusations based on circumstantial evidence, and that any competent estate attorney would tell me that will disputes took years to resolve and were enormously costly, and that perhaps we should all sit down and discuss what a fair resolution might look like for everyone involved. That word, resolution, said the way people say it when they mean, "What will it take to make you go away?" I looked at her and said, "I'm not looking for a resolution. I'm looking for my father's actual will to be executed." She dropped the calm face then. Not all the way, she is disciplined, but enough. She said that my father had made his wishes clear and that she had simply helped him manage the logistics of carrying them out. And that my inability to accept that his relationship with his son had been closer than his relationship with me was a personal problem I needed to address with a therapist, not a courtroom. Several things happened in my body in that moment. I noted all of them and set them aside. I said, "You're right that will disputes are expensive and slow. That's why I'm not filing a civil suit." I took out my phone. I placed a call. It was answered on the first ring. I said, "We're ready." My sister-in-law looked at the front door. Nothing happened yet. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at the folder in my hand. She said, "Who did you call?" I said, "You impersonated a dying man during a cardiac hospitalization in order to redirect his legal documents. You arranged for a fraudulent will to be executed using an attorney with active disciplinary complaints. You timed the reading to exclude a legitimate heir. Those are not civil matters." The front door opened. The agent I had called walked in. She had driven from the field office 40 minutes away. She was wearing a dark jacket and carrying a leather folder. Behind her was a county sheriff's deputy. The neighbor who had grown up next to me let out a low breath. One of my aunts covered her mouth. My brother looked at his wife. He looked at her the way you look at someone when the thing you have been refusing to see becomes impossible to deny. My sister-in-law put one hand on the back of the oak side table my father had built, steadying herself. She said, in a voice that had lost all of its management, that she wanted an attorney. The agent told her she was welcome to call one. I want to be accurate about what happened next, because I have told this story several times and I do not want to overstate it for effect. My sister-in-law was not arrested in my father's living room. That is not how federal investigations work. What happened is that the agent introduced herself, explained that she was following up on documentation I had submitted the previous evening regarding potential estate fraud and wire fraud, and asked my sister-in-law if she would be willing to answer a few questions voluntarily. My sister-in-law said no. She said it clearly and without hesitation, which, honestly, was probably the smartest decision she made in the entire situation. She called her own attorney from the corner of the room while my aunts watched her, and my brother sat down in my father's armchair with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. He stayed like that for a long time. The agent collected the documentation I had compiled. She confirmed the notarization discrepancy I had flagged was consistent with fraud indicators her office had seen in similar cases. She told me the field office would be in contact. Before she left, she paused in the doorway of my father's living room and looked at the handmade oak side table sitting where it had always sat. She asked if my father had made that himself. I said yes. She said, "It was beautiful. It was. It's in my apartment now." My brother called me that night. He had been sitting in his car in the driveway for 2 hours after everyone left, according to the neighbor's text. When he finally called, his voice was the voice of someone who has been stripped of every defensive structure and is speaking from the bottom of whatever is underneath. He said, "I didn't know." I believed him. I still believe him. My brother is not a bad person. He is a person who loved his wife and trusted her completely and chose for years not to examine the things she did on his behalf, because examining them would have required him to become someone he did not want to be. That is a different kind of failure than hers, but it is still a failure, and we have spent a long time since that night working out what to do with it. I said, "I know you didn't know, but you knew something was wrong when I walked into that house, and you didn't say anything." He didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." That was the end of the call. Some conversations don't need more than that. The federal investigation moved faster than estate litigation usually does, which my attorney later told me was because the documentation I provided was unusually complete. The IP records, the email metadata, the hospital admission logs that directly contradicted the notarization date, the bar complaints against the attorney she had used. I had assembled a timeline that required very little additional investigation to follow. When you trace money for a living, you know how to tell a story with records. My sister-in-law was indicted 8 months later on charges including wire fraud, elder financial abuse, and obstruction relating to estate documents. The attorney she had used surrendered his license as part of a separate proceeding. My father's original will, the one Mr. Alderman had on file, the one that split everything equally, was admitted to probate court and executed in full. I received my half of the estate 14 months after my father died. I put most of it into a savings account I do not touch, because it is not money I ever wanted to have this way. But it is my father's money, and it was always supposed to be mine, and I was not going to let someone rewrite that while I was on a plane grieving. My brother and I are still figuring out what we are to each other now. That is the part of this story that has no satisfying resolution, no moment where the handcuffs click and the right people feel the right things. He is my brother. We shared a childhood. He did not do what she did, but he lived beside it and said nothing, and I think about that differently on different days. Some days I call him on Sunday the way I always did. Some days I don't. As for my sister-in-law, she took a plea agreement that included restitution, supervised probation, and a permanent bar from serving as executor, trustee, or power of attorney for anyone other than herself. Her attorney described the evidence against her as overwhelming. I do not know where she is now, and I do not think about her often. She made herself very small in the story of my family, and I have decided to let her stay small. What I think about is my father. I think about him every Wednesday evening, which is still when I would have called him. I think about him in the way you think about someone who showed you what it looked like to build something real and protect it and want it to outlast you. He built a table from reclaimed oak and it is in my apartment, and every morning I drink my coffee at it and I think, he made this with his hands. He wanted this to be in the family, it is. If someone in your life is using access and trust to quietly rewrite what belongs to you, whether it's an estate, a business, a relationship, a story about who you are, I need you to hear this. The documentation exists. It always exists. People who commit financial crimes believe they are invisible because the people they hurt are grieving or distracted or too overwhelmed to look. But the records are there. The IP addresses are there. The timestamps are there. The notary dates are there. Whatever they moved, wherever they moved it, someone wrote it down. Find the paperwork. Find the right person to help you read it. Do not accept the version of the story that was designed to make you feel like the difficult one. You are not difficult. You are paying attention. Those are not the same thing, and the people who want your silence are counting on you to confuse them. Hit like if this story stayed with you. Subscribe if you want more. And if you've been through something similar, an estate dispute, a family betrayal, someone who used your grief against you, leave it in the comments. I read everyone. We are not as alone in this as they want us to believe.